Welcome, the most captivating science fiction stories where mystery, action, and love intertwine are here. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. The morning light filtered through the crystalline spires of the ethereal palace, casting prismatic rainbows across surfaces that hummed with telepathic energy. Lyreley pressed herself deeper into the alcove behind her mother's throne, watching the preparations unfold with a mixture of fascination and dread. Today marked the first official contact between her people and the strange beings from the third planet of the Sol system. Humans, they called themselves. "Stand straighter, daughter," Queen Thessarian's mental voice brushed against the minds of everyone present except, as always, Lyreley. The princess had grown accustomed to receiving her mother's communications through the traditional vocal cords, a necessity that never failed to remind everyone of her deficiency. "Yes, mother," Lyreley whispered, though she doubted anyone would notice her posture from her hiding spot. The irony wasn't lost on her that she, a member of the most telepathically gifted bloodline in Zephyrian history, communicated like the very aliens they were about to meet. The throne room's living walls pulsed with anticipation, their crystalline matrices responding to the collective excitement of the court. Lyreley often wondered what it felt like to have the palace acknowledge your presence, to feel the ancient stones welcoming your thoughts. For her, they remained beautiful but silent, like looking at a conversation through soundproof glass. "Your Majesty," Chancellor Vorthak's mental projection rippled through the assembled courtiers. "The human vessel has achieved orbital insertion. Their primitive combustion-based propulsion system is quaint." A ripple of barely contained amusement passed through the court's shared consciousness, leaving Lyreley to guess at the joke from their facial expressions alone. She had become quite skilled at reading the physical tells that her people usually suppressed, since their minds were typically occupied with mental chatter she couldn't access. "Chancellor," the Queen's voice carried both telepathically and audibly, another concession to Lyreley's presence. "Perhaps we should reserve judgment on their technology until we understand its purposes. After all, they've managed to traverse the void between stars." "With all due respect, Your Majesty," Vorthak's mental tone carried condescension that Lyreley could practically taste. "Our ancestors achieved interstellar travel when these humans were still discovering fire. Their crude rockets and chemical engines hardly qualify as—" His mental dissertation was interrupted by a tremendous crash that echoed through the palace corridors, followed by what sounded distinctly like someone yelling, "Oh, for crying out loud," in a language that definitely wasn't Zephyrian. The court's collective telepathic conversation came to an abrupt halt as everyone's attention turned toward the main entrance. Even the walls seemed to pause their gentle humming, as if the palace itself was holding its breath. "Well," Queen Thessarian said aloud, a trace of amusement coloring her voice, "it appears our guests have arrived." Lyreley leaned forward, her long ears twitching with curiosity. Through the crystalline columns, she could see a procession of figures making their way down the main corridor, accompanied by what appeared to be a floating mechanical device that kept bumping into the walls and emitting apologetic beeping sounds. "Sorry about that," called a voice in heavily accented Zephyrian. "Our gravity adjuster is having some calibration issues. Apparently, your planet's gravitational field has some unusual, gravitational properties." More crashes followed, punctuated by increasingly creative expressions in what Lyreley assumed was the human language. She pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle a giggle, earning herself a sharp look from her mother. The first human to enter the throne room was a tall woman with short, dark hair and skin the color of burnished copper. She wore a form-fitting suit that seemed to shimmer with embedded technology, and her eyes, a startling shade of green that Lyreley had never seen before, swept the room with obvious wonder. "Your Majesty," the woman said, executing what might charitably be called a bow if one were feeling particularly generous. "I am Ambassador Sarah Chen of the United Earth Coalition. We are honored by your willingness to meet with us." The queen inclined her head graciously, though Lyrelay caught the slight twitch at the corner of her mother's mouth that suggested she was fighting back a smile. Welcome to Zephyria Prime, Ambassador Chen. I am Queen Thessarian of the Ethereal Court. Thank you, Your Majesty. Ness, the ambassador replied, then winced slightly at her own phrasing. Forgive me, we're still working on the proper protocols. Our xenolinguistics department assured me they had the honorifics down, but apparently there was some confusion between formal address and restaurant ordering. This time Queen Thessarian did smile. Perhaps we might proceed with simple names, Ambassador. Formality has its place, but understanding is more important than ceremony. That would be fantastic, actually, Ambassador Chen said, visibly relaxing. I've been practicing telepathic meditation for 6 months in preparation for this meeting, but apparently my instructor back on Earth was actually teaching me advanced techniques for ordering takeout. The mental equivalent of polite laughter rippled through the court, though Lyrelay had to rely on facial cues to catch the joke. She found herself oddly grateful for her condition in this moment. At least she was experiencing the humor the same way the humans were. I'm afraid telepathic communication requires years of training to master, Chancellor Vorthak projected, his mental tone carrying barely concealed superiority. Perhaps it would be best if we conducted these proceedings through more primitive means. Ambassador Chen's smile remained diplomatically fixed, but Lyrelay noticed a slight tightening around her eyes. Of course, Chancellor, we're quite accustomed to primitive communication methods. In fact, we've elevated them to an art form. Indeed, the Queen interjected smoothly. Perhaps you could tell us more about your people's situation. Your initial communication mentioned a threat that concerns both our species. The ambassador's expression grew serious. The Void Syndicate. They've been expanding aggressively across our sector for the past decade, consuming entire systems and converting the populations into. She paused, seeming to search for the right words. Let's call them unwilling participants in their collective consciousness. A chill ran through the throne room that had nothing to do with temperature. The concept of forced telepathic assimilation was perhaps the most horrifying thing a Zephyrian could imagine. Our intelligence suggests they're moving toward this system, Ambassador Chen continued. Earth lacks the psychic defenses that your people possess naturally. We were hoping to establish some kind of mutual defense agreement. And what exactly would Earth offer in return? Vorthak's mental question carried skepticism that was probably visible from orbit. Well, Ambassador Chen said, reaching into her suit and producing a small device that immediately began projecting a holographic display. We might not have telepathic abilities, but we've gotten pretty good at blowing things up. The hologram showed footage of human military technology, ships that moved with impossible speed, weapons that could crack planets, and defensive systems that seemed to bend space itself. The display was impressive enough that even the Zephyrian court fell silent. Of course, the ambassador continued with a slight grin, we're also excellent at accidentally breaking things, as you've probably noticed from our dramatic entrance. But sometimes breaking things is exactly what you need. From her hiding place, Lyrelay found herself fascinated not just by the humans' technology, but by their approach to communication. They used their voices, their bodies, even their mechanical devices to convey meaning in ways that seemed almost musical. Where Zephyrian telepathy was direct and efficient, human communication was layered with nuance, humor, and unexpected tangents. Your proposal has merit, the Queen said after a moment of consideration. However, such an alliance would require extensive discussion and planning. Perhaps your delegation would accept our hospitality while we explore these possibilities. That would be wonderful, Ambassador Chen replied. Though I should probably warn you that our cultural attaché has some very specific dietary requirements, and our chief engineer has an unfortunate tendency to take things apart to see how they work. We've learned not to let him near anything that glows, hums, or appears to be alive. Noted, the queen said dryly. I shall have the palace staff secure anything particularly valuable or historically significant. As the formal introductions continued, Lyreley found herself studying the humans with growing curiosity. They seemed so comfortable with their vocal communication, turning what her people considered a crude necessity into something expressive and dynamic. And their technology, while undoubtedly different from Zephyrian crystal-based systems, showed an ingenuity and adaptability that she couldn't help but admire. One more thing, Ambassador Chen added as the meeting began to wind down. We brought a small scientific team to study the unique properties of your world. Nothing invasive, just some readings and observations. One of our xenobiologists is particularly interested in your planet's unusual crystal formations. Chancellor Vorthak's mental projection practically oozed disapproval. I hardly think it wise to allow alien researchers unfettered access to our most sacred. The garden terraces would be suitable, the queen interrupted smoothly. They showcase our crystal cultivation techniques without exposing sensitive areas of the palace. Lyreley's ears perked up at the mention of the gardens. She spent most of her free time there, finding peace among the bioluminescent flora that didn't require telepathic communication to appreciate their beauty. The thought of encountering one of these fascinating humans in her sanctuary was both thrilling and terrifying. As the official proceedings concluded and the various dignitaries began to disperse, Lyreley remained in her alcove, lost in thought. For the first time in years, she felt a stirring of genuine curiosity about the world beyond the palace walls. These humans, with their explosive technology and expressive voices, represented something entirely new in her carefully ordered existence. Perhaps, she thought as she watched the last of the delegation file out of the throne room, being different wasn't always a disadvantage. After all, she might be the only Zephyrian who could truly understand these strange, vocal creatures from the third planet of Sol's system. The thought both excited and terrified her in equal measure. The bioluminescent gardens of Zephyria Prime operated on a rhythm that had nothing to do with the planet's twin suns. As night fell, the crystalline flora began their evening symphony, each bloom pulsing with colors that responded to the telepathic emanations of anyone nearby. For most Zephyrians, walking through the gardens was like conducting an orchestra of light. For Lyreley, it was more like being a tone-deaf observer at a concert she could never fully appreciate. She made her way along the winding paths, her bare feet silent against the warm crystal pathways. The flowers remained stubbornly dim around her, offering only their baseline glow rather than the brilliant displays they reserved for her telepathically gifted relatives. After 23 years, she had stopped feeling bitter about it. Mostly. Well, that's definitely not supposed to be beeping, came a voice from somewhere near the Harmony pools. Lyreley froze, her long ears swiveling toward the sound. The human scientific team wasn't supposed to arrive until tomorrow morning, according to the schedule she'd overheard during the diplomatic meetings. Curiosity overrode caution, and she crept through the silver-leaved thinking ferns toward the source of the disturbance. Through a gap in the foliage, she spotted a figure hunched over a collection of mechanical devices that were indeed beeping, chirping, and in one case, playing what sounded like classical earth music. The human was smaller than Ambassador Chen, with shoulder-length brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and clothing that seemed designed for field work rather than diplomacy. She was currently engaged in what appeared to be a heated argument with a handheld device. "Come on, you temperamental piece of..." The human stopped mid-sentence and tried a different approach. "Please, dear sweet scanner, could you possibly tell me why you're detecting 17 different types of impossible energy signatures from a single flower?" The device responded with a sound that could only be described as electronic laughter. "That's it," the human muttered. "I'm reporting you to tech support. See how you like being recalibrated by Jenkins in engineering. He still thinks percussive maintenance is a valid diagnostic technique. Despite herself, Lyrale found her hand pressed to her mouth to stifle a giggle. The human's one-sided conversation with her equipment was unlike anything she'd witnessed in the formal telepathic communications of her people. "Is someone there?" The human called out suddenly, looking up from her devices. "I heard. Well, I thought I heard laughing, but maybe it was just another malfunction. At this point, I wouldn't be surprised if my equipment started doing stand-up comedy." Lyrale's first instinct was to flee, as she had been doing her entire life whenever strangers appeared. But something about this human's casual demeanor made her hesitate. Before she could make a decision either way, her foot caught on a crystalline root, sending her tumbling through the ferns with all the grace of a meteor impact. "Whoa!" the human exclaimed, jumping to her feet as Lyrale emerged from the foliage with leaves in her hair and dirt on her robes. "Are you okay?" That sounded like. Actually, that sounded exactly like how I imagine I'll exit most situations during this mission. Lyrale scrambled to her feet, brushing herself off and trying to recover some semblance of dignity. The human was staring at her with obvious curiosity, but not the uncomfortable kind she was used to receiving from her own people. "I'm Dr. Elena Vasquez," the human said, extending her hand in what Lyrale recognized as a greeting gesture from the cultural briefings she'd overheard. Xenobiologist, professional equipment argumentator, and apparently the only person on this expedition who thought working in an alien garden at night was a good idea. Lyrale stared at the extended hand, unsure of the proper protocol. "I am Lyrale," she said carefully, her voice rusty from disuse. "Nice to meet you, Lyrale," Elena said, lowering her hand when it became clear the gesture wasn't going to be reciprocated. "I don't suppose you could help me figure out why my scanner is convinced that flower over there is simultaneously dead, alive, and auditioning for a musical theater production." Against her better judgment, Lyrale found herself moving closer to examine the device. Elena's equipment was a fascinating hybrid of sleek design and obviously improvised modifications. Cables connected components that clearly weren't meant to work together, and several pieces were held in place with what appeared to be multicolored adhesive tape. "Your scanner is confused?" Lyrale asked, struggling with the unfamiliar concept of technology that couldn't simply interface directly with its operator's mind. "Confused is putting it mildly," Elena replied, tapping the device's screen. "According to this, that crystalline harmony bloom is generating 17 different types of energy I've never seen before, singing in 12-part harmony, and somehow registering as both a plant and a sentient being. Oh, and it's apparently very disappointed in my life choices." Lyrale looked at the flower in question, one of the garden's prize specimens. To her eyes, it was simply a beautiful bloom with 6 translucent petals that shifted between blue and silver. "It's a harmony bloom," she said simply. "They respond to thought." "Thought?" Elena's eyebrows shot up. "You mean like actual telepathic communication?" "Yes, though Lyrale hesitated, unsure how to explain her deficiency to an alien who might not understand the stigma attached to it. The emergency klaxons began wailing at precisely 3 in the morning, Zephyrian Standard Time, which Elena had learned was roughly equivalent to the most inconvenient hour possible in any civilization. She jolted awake in her assigned quarters, immediately reaching for her scanner before remembering that it was currently disassembled across her desk in what she optimistically called routine maintenance, and her colleagues would undoubtedly term, "Elena broke something again." "All personnel to emergency stations," came the telepathic broadcast that her universal translator helpfully converted into monotone English. "Unknown vessels detected at system periphery. Repeat, unknown vessels detected." Elena threw on her field clothes and grabbed her emergency kit, which consisted primarily of duct tape, a multifunction scanner that only worked on Tuesdays, and a thermos of coffee that she'd learned to guard with her life. The corridors of the ethereal palace were alive with activity, as courtiers and staff moved with the sort of organized panic that suggested this wasn't entirely unexpected. She nearly collided with Lyrale at the intersection leading to the command center, the Zephyrian princess looking uncharacteristically frazzled as she hurried along the crystalline passageways. "Alina," Lyrale called out, her long ears twitching with anxiety. "The Void Syndicate scouts have arrived, 3 days ahead of our intelligence projections." "Well," Alina replied, falling into step beside her, "in my experience, bad guys never stick to the schedule. It's like they do it on purpose, just to mess with our carefully planned responses." They entered the command center to find controlled chaos. Queen Thessarian stood at the central console, her mental commands flowing to various stations as holographic displays showed the approaching threat. Ambassador Chen was already there, looking like she'd had about as much sleep as Alina, which was to say none at all. "Dr. Vasquez," the ambassador called out, "we need those energy readings you've been collecting. Command wants to know if the syndicate ships are showing any unusual signatures." Alina pulled out her backup scanner, the one she'd cobbled together from spare parts and stubborn determination. "Define unusual. Because if we're talking about energy signatures that make my equipment question its life choices, then yes, absolutely." The scanner's display showed readings that were, to put it scientifically, completely bonkers. "These ships aren't just using conventional propulsion," she announced. "They're somehow interfacing directly with subspace itself. It's like they're surfing on the fabric of reality." Chancellor Vorthak's mental projection rippled with disdain. "Impossible. Such technology would require a complete understanding of dimensional mechanics that even we have not achieved." "Yeah, well," Alina shrugged, "impossible is kind of my specialty. Last week I figured out how to make my toaster communicate with my scanner. Turns out they were having philosophical differences about optimal browning temperatures." "This is no time for levity." Vorthak's thoughts carried sharp disapproval. "These beings represent an existential threat to our civilization." "Actually," Lyrale spoke up quietly, "humor might be exactly what we need right now. Alina's approach to problems is different from ours. Perhaps different is what we require." Alina shot her a grateful look. Over the past few days, their unlikely friendship had grown through shared conversations about everything from xenobiology to the proper brewing temperature for Earth coffee. Lyrale had proven to be not just an excellent listener, but someone whose unique perspective on her own world had helped Alina understand things that traditional telepathic analysis missed entirely. "The lead vessel is hailing us," reported the communications officer, a young Zephyrian whose mental voice carried barely contained terror. "On screen," Queen Thessarian commanded. The main display flickered to life, revealing something that made Alina's scanner emit what she'd learned to recognize as its deeply concerned beeping pattern. The being that appeared was humanoid in the loosest sense, its features shifting and flowing as if it couldn't quite decide what form to maintain. When it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that hurt to hear. "Greetings, children of Zephyria Prime," the entity said, its words somehow bypassing the usual translation protocols and speaking directly into everyone's minds. "We are the Void Syndicate. We have come to offer you unity." "Unity?" Queen Thessarian's voice remained steady despite the obvious strain of resisting the mental intrusion. "What form does this unity take?" "The same form it takes for all species," the entity replied with what might have been a smile. "Complete integration into our collective consciousness. Individual thought is chaos. We offer perfect order." Alina's scanner was now beeping so frantically it sounded like a smoke alarm. "Your Majesty," she called out, "my readings show massive telepathic energy building up around their ships. Whatever they're planning to do, they're about to do it." The entity's shifting features focused on Alina with sudden interest. Curious, a mind that resists scanning, We have encountered your species before, human. Your chaotic thoughts proved difficult to integrate. Many of your people chose self-termination rather than accept unity. Yeah, that sounds like us, Alina replied drily. We're really bad at joining groups. Most of us can't even agree on pizza toppings. Alina, Ambassador Chen hissed, maybe don't antagonize the all-powerful psychic collective. Why not? They're planning to mind control us anyway. Might as well go down with a good one-liner. Lyreley stepped forward, her voice carrying across both telepathic and vocal channels. What of those who cannot be integrated? What becomes of them? The entity's attention shifted to her, and Alina saw something she didn't like in its shifting expression. Ah, the defective one. We sensed your presence during our approach. Do not concern yourself with integration, broken child. Your neural patterns are too corrupted for unity. You will simply be discarded. Alina felt something hot and protective surge through her chest. Excuse me, did you just call her defective? Alina, no, Lyreley whispered. But Alina was already moving, her scanner held high and beeping with increasing urgency. Listen here, you shape-shifting assimilation wannabe, Alina said, stepping between Lyreley and the display. That woman has more insight into the fundamental nature of this planet than your entire collective has managed to achieve. She communicates with living crystal formations that have existed for millions of years. She's not defective, she's evolved. The entity paused, its features stabilizing slightly as it processed this information. Impossible. Our scans detected no telepathic capability. That's because you're scanning for the wrong thing. Alina's scientific passion overrode her diplomatic sense entirely. Telepathy is just one form of consciousness interface. Lyreley doesn't broadcast thoughts, she receives them. She's listening to frequencies you can't even detect. Alina, Ambassador Chen said urgently, what are you doing? Probably something stupid, Alina admitted, but definitely something necessary. She pulled out her telepathic resonance amplifier, the device she'd been working on with Lyreley in the gardens. Want to see something impossible, void face? Lyreley, remember what we discovered about the crystal matrix? Lyreley nodded, understanding passing between them without need for telepathic contact. She placed her hands on the command center's central console, a massive crystalline interface that connected to the palace's living architecture. Alina activated the amplifier, and immediately the palace itself began to respond. Not just the walls and floors, but the very bedrock of Zephyria Prime. The crystalline formations that had grown throughout the planet over millions of years suddenly came alive with harmonic resonance, their combined song creating a telepathic frequency so deep and powerful that even Alina could feel it. By the void, the entity gasped, its form flickering as the planetary resonance interfered with its concentration. What is this? This, Alina said with satisfaction, is what happens when you underestimate the quiet ones. Lyreley isn't broken. She's the only one who can hear the planet's true voice. And guess what? Your little mind control tricks don't work when the entire world is singing a different tune. The syndicate ships in orbit were already pulling back, their telepathic weapons rendered useless by the planetary interference. The entity on the screen was struggling to maintain coherence as the deep crystal harmonics disrupted its collective consciousness. This is not possible, it managed to say. Individual consciousness cannot resist the unity of the collective. Maybe not, Alina replied, grinning as her scanner played a little victory tune she'd programmed into it. But planetary consciousness, that's a whole different game, and it turns out Lyreley here has been playing it her entire life. The transmission cut off as the syndicate vessels retreated to a safe distance, their mental dominance broken by frequencies older than their civilization. Well, Ambassador Chen said into the sudden silence, that was either the most brilliant tactical move I've ever witnessed, or we just made enemies of a force that could obliterate our entire sector. Probably both, Alina admitted cheerfully. But hey, at least now we know that Lyreley isn't defective. She's basically a planetary communications specialist. That's going on her resume for sure. Lyrelay was staring at the crystalline console, which was still glowing with residual energy from their connection. "I heard them," she whispered. "All of them. Every crystal formation on Zephyria Prime. They've been trying to communicate for millennia, but no one was listening properly. Because everyone was too busy broadcasting to receive," Alina said softly. "Sometimes the most important conversations happen in whispers." Queen Thessarian approached them, her expression mixing awe with maternal pride. "It would seem, daughter, that your differences are not a limitation but a gift we never understood. Does this mean I get to leave the alcove behind the throne?" Lyrelay asked with a small smile. "I think," the queen replied, "it means you get to sit wherever you choose." Alina watched the interaction with satisfaction, her scanner humming contentedly in the background. Sometimes the best scientific discoveries came not from looking harder at the data, but from listening to what everyone else had missed. Though she still planned to have a serious talk with her equipment about its timing on the victory music. 3 weeks after the Syndicate's retreat, Alina found herself sitting in what used to be called the Defective Princess's Garden, but had recently been renamed the Planetary Communications Hub. The change in nomenclature had been Lyrelay's idea, though she'd presented it with her characteristic dry humor as a minor adjustment to reflect current operational parameters. "I still can't believe your mother agreed to let you redesign the entire telepathic defense grid," Alina said, adjusting her latest scanner modification. This one had been constructed from a combination of Zephyrian crystal technology and human engineering stubbornness, and it was currently attempting to translate the planet's geological humor into something approaching readable data. Lyrelay looked up from where she was calibrating a crystalline interface that resembled a cross between a musical instrument and a very sophisticated communications array. I think she was mostly relieved to discover I wasn't actually defective, though she did ask if I could please keep the planetary awakening sessions to reasonable hours. Apparently, having the entire world humming telepathic lullabies at 3 in the morning disturbs the court's sleep patterns. "Reasonable request," Alina agreed. "Though I have to admit, waking up to harmonic crystal formations is probably better than waking up to my scanner's malfunction alerts. Yesterday it decided to compose poetry about its existential crisis with the coffee maker." The integration of human and Zephyrian technology had progressed faster than anyone had expected, largely because Alina's approach to impossible problems meshed perfectly with Lyrelay's ability to communicate with systems that everyone else assumed were simply decorative. Together, they had created a planetary defense network that operated on frequencies the Void Syndicate couldn't detect, let alone disrupt. "Alina," came Ambassador Chen's voice from the communication crystal Alina had learned to recognize by its slightly judgmental hum. "We need you and Lyrelay in the main conference chamber. The Syndicate has sent another transmission." "On our way," Alina replied, then turned to Lyrelay. "Ready for round 2 with our shape-shifting friends." "As ready as one can be for beings who consider individual thought a design flaw," Lyrelay replied, standing and smoothing her robes. Over the past weeks, she had grown more confident in her movements, no longer carrying herself like someone apologizing for existing. They made their way through corridors that now pulsed with a gentle harmony of human technology and Zephyrian crystal matrices. The integration had been Alina's proudest achievement, though it had required her to completely rebuild her scanner's personality core, after it had what could only be described as a nervous breakdown from trying to analyze living architecture. The conference chamber buzzed with activity. Representatives from both species worked side by side at stations that would have been impossible to imagine just a month ago. Alina spotted Chancellor Vorthak attempting to operate a human data tablet while muttering telepathic complaints about primitive input methods. While nearby, Lieutenant Rodriguez from Alina's team was having what appeared to be a philosophical debate with a sentient crystal formation about the nature of consciousness. "Ah, there they are," Queen Thessarian called out as Alina and Lyrale entered. "Our resident experts in impossible solutions." "That's Dr. Alina Vasquez, professional problem solver and part-time equipment whisperer," Alina corrected with a grin. "And Princess Lyrale, planetary communications specialist and full-time voice of reason." Ambassador Chen gestured toward the main display. "The Syndicate wants to negotiate." "Negotiate?" Lyrale's ears twitched with surprise. "The collective consciousness that considers individuality a disease wants to negotiate." "Apparently," the ambassador replied. "Our little demonstration convinced them that forced assimilation might not be as straightforward as they initially calculated." The display activated, revealing the same shifting entity they'd encountered before, though its form seemed more stable now, less fluid in its constant transformations. "Greetings, defenders of Zephyria Prime," the being said, its voice carrying less of the intrusive mental pressure than before. "We wish to discuss terms." "Terms for what?" Queen Thessarian asked. "Your withdrawal from this system." "Terms for coexistence," the entity replied, which caused Alina's scanner to emit what she'd learned to interpret as its deeply suspicious beeping pattern. "Your planetary defense network has proven problematic for our standard integration protocols. We propose an alternative arrangement." Alina exchanged glances with Lyrale, who was already placing her hands on the nearest crystal interface to gauge the planet's reaction to the Syndicate's presence. The crystalline formations throughout the chamber began humming softly, their light shifting to what Alina had learned was the geological equivalent of skeptical interest. "What kind of arrangement?" Ambassador Chen asked. "A partnership," the entity said. "Your people possess unique capabilities. The human capacity for chaotic innovation, combined with the Zephyrian telepathic abilities and this new, planetary consciousness interface, could prove valuable to our expansion efforts." "Let me get this straight," Alina said, standing up and pointing her scanner at the display. "You want us to help you assimilate other species. We offer to share the benefits of unity while preserving your individual quirks, a compromise that maintains the collective while acknowledging the utility of diversity." Lyrale's connection with the crystal network deepened, and suddenly every crystalline formation in the chamber began singing in harmonious discord. Alina didn't need telepathic abilities to understand what the planet was trying to communicate. It was the geological equivalent of laughter. "I don't think that's going to work," Lyrale said, her voice carrying the resonance of the planetary network. "You see, we've discovered something interesting during your absence." She gestured to Alina, who activated her modified scanner with theatrical flair. "We've been analyzing the energy signatures from your ships, and it turns out your collective consciousness isn't as unified as you think it is." The display showed wave patterns that looked like musical notes.